This is Loris Baz, the MotoGP rider no one wanted. And no one wanted him because he was too big. But why is that such a problem? Well, there's some really interesting reasons why, but there's also a few reasons why it was actually an advantage. I'll explain exactly what they are in this video, as well as talk you through how Loris Baz, despite all odds, managed to secure a ride in the Premier Class motorbike racing series. Let's have a quick look at the majority of professional motorbike riders. They tend to be smaller and shorter. How come? Well, there's a few different benefits, which means there are all disadvantages for bigger riders. Take the bike itself. Imagine all of your other riders have been a similar height, somewhere between 5'5" and 5'10". Every team will have an idea of this rough size and build certain adjustable parts for the bike. These could be things like handlebars, foot pegs, fairings, and so on. They'll have a certain range of adjustments. They don't need to keep manufacturing different parts. They can just simply adjust them depending on the rider. Once you've got all of these parts made up, imagine then you have a much bigger rider come in and try and fit on the bike. For reference, Loris Baz was 6'3", and trying to fit on a MotoGP bike would have been a really tough job. The adjustable parts just might not have been enough. Take the handlebars for example. If they're set as far away as they can go, they might be really close to touching the front fairing. If they can't be adjusted anymore, it becomes pretty uncomfortable. But that's just one of the disadvantages. An even bigger issue is a rider's weight. MotoGP riders tend to be very light, and weight makes a huge difference in motorbike racing. For some context on how much difference it can make, let's have a quick look at F1 drivers first. Lewis Hamilton weighs 73 kilos. Yuki Tsunoda weighs 54 kilos. There's a 19 kilo difference between the two of them. Now, the absolute minimum an F1 car can weigh is 798 kilos. So if you take the combined weight of the F1 car and each driver, you get a total weight difference of around 2.3%. Now, that's not enough to make a huge difference, but it's not enough to ignore either. More weight means more lap time, plain and simple. Now let's take a look at the same example in MotoGP. Loris Baz weighed 79 kilos and Dani Pedrosa weighed 51 kilos. A MotoGP bike weighs roughly 159 kilos. So the combined weight of each rider plus the bike makes a staggering 11.8% difference, which means in almost all scenarios, a lighter rider is better. The key word is almost. We'll get to that in a second. But a lighter and smaller rider is going to be faster in a straight line. Their power to weight ratio is better and they'll be able to accelerate faster. And to top it all off, a smaller rider can tuck in behind the fairings better than a bigger rider. Bigger riders stick out more and create more drag. But there is a certain point where being smaller and lighter is a problem. Take Dani Pedrosa, who we just spoke about. He had to work so much harder on the bike, there was just less of him. There's actually a sweet spot somewhere in the mid 60 kilo mark. Take the world champion Jorge Martin. He's only 5'6", but he weighs 63 kilos. Being a little bit heavier is actually better nowadays because the bikes are generally heavier and they've got more aero, so the riders need to work harder to get the bike to move around. So yes, generally in most cases, being smaller is better, but there are some advantages to being bigger, which we'll touch on later in this video. Unfortunately for Loris, he didn't have a great start to his racing career. Any motorsport is expensive. Karting, club racing, in cars or bikes, you name it. And a lot of people never get a chance to race in real life. Loris started racing in smaller championships with support from his family. There wasn't much in the way of sponsors at the time. As Loris became more experienced, the natural step was to move up into higher classes of bike racing, but he needed a lot more money. Loris's family obviously wanted to support him, and his dad did an incredible amount to get the funds together to make sure that Loris could carry on racing. His dad sold the family house, sold his cars, closed down his business, and lived in a van for months to make sure Loris could keep racing. But even this wasn't enough. In 2008, Loris and his family were in a pretty big financial hole. By this point, Loris was racing in the World Superstock European Championship. Even though it was a slightly smaller series, they needed to spend around 50 to 60,000 euros every single season. It just wasn't financially sustainable. So Loris's racing career looked like it was coming to an end. However, his luck was about to change. A chap called Jean-Claude Olivier saw Baz's talent and agreed to cover all of his costs so he could carry on racing. Jean-Claude, by the way, was president of Yamaha Motor France, so he knew his stuff. And this was where he could start using his size to his advantage. A big thing was the ability to corner better. Being heavier means you have more momentum. Now we are getting a little bit more technical here, but I've broken it down to make sure it makes sense. Momentum is a product of mass times velocity. The bike itself has a certain amount of mass. If you take Danny and Loris, their weight difference was around 28 kilos. At 100 kilometers an hour, Loris had 13%-ish more momentum than Danny. Basically, more mass equals more momentum. But having more momentum can be a disadvantage in certain situations. Momentum resists changes in motion. So for Loris, this meant the bike and rider combination needed more energy to change direction. It's physics. More mass moving at speed takes more force to redirect. On the other hand, that extra momentum gave Loris an advantage when he was leading and entering a corner. He could literally throw his bike into a corner more aggressively than the other lighter riders, using his weight to push the bike down and initiate lean angles faster. The other key advantage is energy efficiency or energy conservation, and it comes down to something called kinetic energy. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion. It's basically how much oomph something has. The faster and heavier something is, the more kinetic energy it has. Let's have another quick look at the comparison between Loris and Danny. At the same speed, Loris has more kinetic energy than Danny because he's heavier. But that doesn't mean he uses more energy overall. In a big braking zone, for example, a heavier rider can lean more on the bike's braking system and their weight to slow the bike down. Plus, with the extra weight pushing the tyres into the ground, Loris wouldn't have to work as hard to keep the bike stable under heavy braking. Bigger riders also have another advantage in the corners. When cornering, the rider and bike generate something called centrifugal force, which wants to push them outwards. To stay on track, the rider needs to counteract this balance by leaning inwards. Even though a heavier rider generates more of this force, they tend to have more muscle mass, which allows them to absorb and manage these forces better. It's the same story in chicanes and changes of direction. They're perfect for bigger riders. Think about the force it takes to throw the bike from being fully leant over to the right to then fully leant over to the left. It's a huge movement. Imagine you're trying to undo a really tight bolt. If you have a teeny tiny little ratchet, it's going to be really difficult. If you have a much larger ratchet, it's going to be a lot easier to undo. You've got more leverage, and that's exactly what the bigger riders use. Valentino Rossi was a great example of this. He was, at the time, bigger than the average rider, and he loved making overtakes in places where riders needed to change direction fast. Fast forward to mid-2010, Loris joined the British Superbike Championship midway through the season, unsurprisingly with Motorpoint Yamaha. He set into a pretty good pace straight away and managed to grab a few top 10 finishes. He carried on this momentum in his second year in BSB as well, with another string of top 5s and top 10s. But the main goal for Loris was always to get into MotoGP, and in 2014 he had his first opportunity. The MotoGP grid in 2014 looked like this. You had the factory class and the open class. Loris was in talks with the Driver M7 Aspar team in the open class. For quick reference, the open class came from the old CRT rule a few years back. They were basically highly modified World Superbike and road bikes which had special MotoGP electronics in them. Anyways, the Aspar team had switched to Hondas for that year, and they were using the RC213V RS and the RCV1000R. Now these weren't exactly big bikes. Loris Camier, who was standing at 6'2" and racing with the Aspar team that year, said in an interview, "I'm on the limit. The handlebars can't go further forward without hitting the fairing. Baz would struggle to fit." Also, Loris had very long arms, which was yet another thing that went against him. With all of these possibilities up in the air, after some initial talks, the whole deal fell through, with the Aspar team having doubts on Loris's side. They just didn't think he'd fit. It was a huge blow for Loris's career, but it wasn't like there weren't any successful tall riders in MotoGP. The GOAT of MotoGP, Valentino Rossi, wasn't exactly small. He just made up for it in loads of other ways. Rossi was near as makes no difference 6 foot tall. In theory, he shouldn't have been as good as he was. He just happened to have heaps of natural talent to make up for his size. He had an insane amount of front end feeling no one else did. And he used his size to an advantage like we said earlier, picking great spots to overtake where his size would be a benefit. Although the team did have to keep an eye on his size and weight just a bit. Yamaha on more than one occasion had to take fuel out of his bike to try and match the weight better to the other riders of the time. This meant on more than one occasion he nearly ran out of fuel before the race finished. So why was Loris Baz's size so much more of an issue? Well, Rossi at his absolute heaviest was 70 kilos. We know how much of a difference weight can have on motorbikes. And we also know roughly the sweet spot, which Rossi was on at the upper end of that scale. Baz simply wasn't. He was also another 3 inches taller than Rossi. Again, it doesn't sound like much, but it does make a difference. The margins are smaller in motorbike racing. So yes, Rossi was a tall rider. It's just Baz's additional height and weight was that much more of a problem. But in 2015, Loris Baz finally secured a ride in MotoGP. Loris partnered with Claudio Corti for the 2015 season with Forward Racing Yamaha. His first season saw a string of good results with multiple top 15 finishes, and at the San Marino Grand Prix in relatively tricky conditions, he achieved his career best finish of 4th place, narrowly missing out on the podium. For the next season in 2016, Loris moved to the Avintia Ducati racing team on a year-old GP14. Now, because the bike was a year old, he was never going to be fighting at the front. But another string of top 15s and a season best 5th was another great season for Loris Baz. In 2016, he stayed with Avintia Racing Ducati and managed to grab a GP 2015. But his teammate Hector Barbera was on a year-old 2016, so he was on the back foot. It didn't stop his performance though. He grabbed his best ever season in MotoGP, with 9 top 15s and 4 top 10s. That was unfortunately his last full season in MotoGP, but he did make one more appearance in 2018 at the Silverstone Grand Prix for Red Bull KTM, replacing an injured Pol Espargaro. But that was his last time racing in the Premier Class Series. Loris Baz still holds the record for being the biggest MotoGP rider in history. But being the biggest is one thing. Baz was far from the unluckiest rider. That title goes to someone we spoke about earlier, Dani Pedrosa. If you want to know just how unlucky Dani was, click on this video here, where I go through everything that happened in his career. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one.